Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for the actual main stage of MSI, day number 1, round number 1, my overview and analysis video. It's finally time to get into the best teams in the world facing off. The play-ins have been fun to cover on this channel, but the gameplay has been sloppy to say the very least, and I'm hopeful that things will get better moving forward. Spoiler alert, maybe we're gonna have to wait a little bit longer for some clean gameplay out of teams, because day 1, certainly not the cleanest between either of these two, but it certainly was fun nonetheless. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you think of the games that were played last night? Did you enjoy the gameplay? Were you shocked by the fact that it was so messy and so chaotic? Or, you know, are you kind of enjoying the way that the meta has started to unfold? I'll kind of give my thoughts moving forward as well. Of course, no spoilers for those of you who have not watched the series, but most of you probably have. So you know what I'm talking about. But without further ado, let's get into the content. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover. And at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will, of course, also be updating the bracket at the end of the video because, you know, we got to look forward and see where these teams are looking at. But, you know, it's just the first series of the main stage. No real, you know, big implications just yet. We don't even know who either of these two teams will be facing moving forward. But let's go ahead and jump into the analysis of the series itself. Of course, you can already see it up on the screen. You know what you clicked on. It's a matchup between the number 1 seed from the LCK in Gen.G and the number 2 seed from the LEC in G2 Esports. This is, you know, kind of an interesting matchup on paper because I think that there are things pushing against both of these teams right now and also pushing for both of these teams, and we'll kind of talk about the pros and the cons of both of them coming into this series right now, like at this specific moment, rather than having, you know, a bunch of time to build up in the main stage. For Gen.G, who are definitely considered favorites not only in this series but at this tournament, considering the fact that they have not lost a best of series so far in the spring split, 18-0 in the regular season. They won their best of 5 against Hanwha Life barely by reverse sweeping them 3-2 to make their way here as the number 1 seed out of the LCK. They are the tournament favorites by a lot. I put them in a tier alone at the top of my power rankings, and that's the biggest thing obviously going for them, is their recent form and just the sheer amount of talent on this team. You have 4 of the best players of all time on this team. Keen in the top lane, who's, you know, probably a top 5-ish top laner ever. He could be, he's definitely like top 7 or 8 or so, but you can kind of make some arguments for a couple of players. Canyon, who's inarguably like a top 2 jungler of all time. Chovy, who might be a top 5 player of all time, regardless of role. Ruler, who I think is the best AD carry of all time, although I know that that's a bit more of a controversial statement. And then a young gun Enduro, who I think is stepped up a ton over the course of this year. This is the most talented team in the world, and it's not particularly close, and they've shown it across this entire year. So you want a team that has everything going for them right now. This is it. They can play any style, they can play any kind of game because they have players that can really adapt to anything. They like to skirmish a lot in the mid game, but they're also pretty slow in comparison to a lot of other teams. That means they're a bit more controlled, they're a bit more calculated in how they want to play the game, and honestly, that can help them a lot at times. But the thing going against them, at least in this particular matchup, is they just got here. They're the last team to get to Canada for MSI. I think they got in like 24 hours before their game ended up starting or something like that, and you can see it on the faces of these players. I know there's that funny clip of Chovy barely able to keep his eyes open during draft, and it's like, okay, these guys are jet-lagged, they are tired, they are exhausted. It is clear there is something going on with Gen.G, and that might be affecting their performance. You know, I'm not going to sit here and say that, you know, even a weakened Gen.G should struggle with a team like G2, but, you know, it's something that you have to at the very least take into account. Now for G2 on the other side, they also have good and bad things going for them. The good for this team is they are also pretty talented, at least from a surface level perspective. Caps, in my opinion, still has a great argument to be the best player in the West, although I think Inspired has really kind of usurped him in terms of current ability, even if Caps is the best player of all time coming out of the West. And I think there's a lot of other talent on this team as well. I think Skewmond has been a bit underrated at this tournament. I'm not a big fan of Skewmond. I think he's very one-dimensional as a player. He's really good on these champions that, you know, can control space in particular and want to play for late game team fights. Things like Maokai, things like, you know, Sejuani, Trundle, you know, Wukong. These more passive picks that aren't going to be skirmishing a ton in the early game. Not necessarily the meta right now because things like Xin Zhao and Pantheon and Vi are all really strong, and he can play things like that, especially the Pantheon. Like, it's fine for him, but really his bread and butter is going to be on those space-eating engage tanks in the back half of the game, and that can be an effective strategy, but it also can be exploited, especially in Fearless Draft. I put Skewmund as like my 4th best jungler in the LEC, and people got real mad at me for being too low on him. Now I'm getting claims in my comment section of being too high on Skewmund for how he's been at this tournament. I think he's been fine. He certainly has not been the problem. That's been everybody else on this team. Broken Blade's a good player. Hansama and Labrov can be good players. They have not been as of late. Broken Blade might have been the single worst player in the play-in stage. He really was horrendous through the first 2 series, and there were even times in that 3rd and final series against Gam where he was starting to underperform into Kiaya, although I would say that that was easily his best performance of the play-in stage, which is good to see because, that was the last series, so getting better over the course of the tournament is expected. Broken Blade has really struggled this year. I think part of it is the lane swap changes. I don't think he can just kind of survive in the early game nearly as effectively as he could a couple of years ago, and he's kind of reverting to the TSM Schalke version of Broken Blade that would consistently get caught out in 1v1s near the top or bottom side of the map, just stepping too far forward. If he can clean that up, I think things are going to get better. He's still a good team fighter. He's just making a lot of mental mistakes right now and clearly getting tilted. My bigger concern is the bot lane here. Hansama and Labrov have just been horrible at this tournament. Labrov has his own set of problems where it's just he doesn't fit well on G2 at all. I've gone in depth on that. I've talked about this team so much already at this tournament that it feels almost like I'm repeating myself over and over again, but Labrov is just a player who doesn't necessarily connect well with everybody else on G2 because he is a lot more passive, kind of in that Skewmund mold that he wants to play for team fights and sometimes can get a bit over-eager if he has to try to skirmish a lot. And quite frankly, Hansama's just been bad over the course of 2025. I just don't think this guy has been elite really at anything. He was good in the playoffs domestically, as he always is. He's been awful at this tournament so far. I think there is an even bigger argument to make that he has been a bigger problem than Broken Blade than people are giving him credit for. He has been borderline unplayable at times for G2 unless he's given a ton of resources. But, there are things going for them, specifically that they do have momentum from the play-in stage. I think getting to play a ton of stage games on this patch in particular, always a bonus. Like, the play-in buff is very real in the sense that, getting time to get used to playing on a new patch is always a really big positive for these teams on stage, and G2 is going to have that over a team in Gen.G that not only just got here to Canada and has to worry a bit about jet lag and, getting used to playing in the environment, but also only played 1 best of 5 the entirety of the spring split because their regular season was best of 3 and their playoff format meant that they only played 1 best of 5. They played 1 best of 5 in like 3 months. Like, this is not a team that's particularly practiced in these long series. So G2 definitely has that going for them. The thing going against them is that they've looked pretty awful. Like, there's really nothing else to say. This team has not looked great, and I think that that is the concern. I would, expect Gen.G to be able to mop the floor with them on their best day, but who knows? Like, you never know what's going to happen in an MSI series like this, and there are things kind of pushing against Gen.G and pushing for G2, most specifically, again, just practical experience over the past couple of months. But the only way to know how this series is going to go is to go game by game. So without further ado, let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and you wanted to start off with a bang? Well, here it is. Here is your, gunshot. This is Furia taking down G2 in game 1 levels of, okay, now I'm interested. Now I'm going to be paying attention a bit more to the rest of this series. I think a lot of people, cursed this series a little bit, me included, but I think a lot of analysts out there cursed this series a little bit. You saw so many people out there being like, well, I could see anybody winning a game except for G2 into Gen.G. Like, that's always a curse. It's never going to last. But credit to G2. They got basically everything that they're comfortable on in game number 1. They, kind of played towards their strengths, and Gen.G didn't have a real answer to it. Credit to, Skewmund in particular, who I think had a really good game. But if you are new here, what we're doing, at least in terms of the recap, is we're going to talk about draft first, and then we're going to talk about how that ended up affecting the game itself as it played out a bit further. In terms of draft, I think that this is kind of a difficult one to project out because Gen.G should have a ton of pressure in the early game. Xin Zhao obviously is going to outpressure Maokai, just generally speaking, and you would expect Canyon to be really aggressive playing into a player like Skewmund, who shouldn't be able to answer a lot of these macro plays or, skirmishes that Canyon wants to go for. That's not really how things ended up happening. It was G2 who was making a lot of the proactive plays. Part of that is because Gen.G just naturally is a bit slower of a team, even if G2 is also kind of a slow team. But even more than that, I think it's pretty clear that this team just didn't have a clear direction of where they wanted to put resources, and the 2 lanes that they expected to dominate, Renekton on the top side, which, by the way, should obliterate this Jax in terms of how this laning phase goes. I do not think this is a close laning phase in terms of, the isolation of like Renekton with Xin Zhao help versus Jax with anybody's help throughout this game. Keen should be ridiculously far ahead, which at times he was, but at times he also wasn't. And then also Lucian, who needs to be up in this lane with Braum. You're picking it for the 2v2 and to win pre-level 3. You need to be able to generate that shove and that push in the lane, and you need to be able to step up. Neither of those things really happened at the level that Gen.G was looking for, and G2 has all the scaling in this game. I know you're looking at an Azir for Gen.G, and it is Chovy's Azir. So when I say that Gen.G doesn't have a ton of scaling here, maybe you can counter it by just saying, well, you've got the best player in the world on a pick that does scale into the late game, but G2 have Maokai to be able to shut it down relatively efficiently. You have a Jax jumping onto the backline. Yone is going to make things difficult. The combo potential of Yone ultimate into Rakan knockup is absolutely massive, especially as this game goes on longer. It's just so much easier for G2 to play out team fights if they're going into it from neutral or from ahead in any situation, and that's essentially what happened. Gen.G didn't get a big enough early game lead on a comp that kind of needs an early game lead, and they ended up just bleeding out in that respect. But credit to G2, because I honestly think they were making the more proactive plays. They were the better team in game number 1, and I don't even think it's really all that close. Now, I do want to give a little bit of a caveat, and this might feel a bit like a cop-out, and I hope it doesn't, but the biggest caveat I can give is that, yeah, G2 got everything in this game in terms of what they were looking for, and Gen.G clearly did not come into this series super prepared for G2 in particular, and like what they're good at, because leaving Maokai up on red side is inexcusable against G2 Esports. This is the only champion that it ever feels like they have full control of the map with. It's Scumon's best champion by far. That was the case last year on BDS Academy as well. This isn't something new about Scumon. It's not like, oh, he just plays well on engaged tanks because it's G2 and they want to put resources elsewhere. This is just who he is as a player, and sitting here and, you know, giving that to him for free on red side when every other team in the play-in stage banned it out and he looked significantly worse on other things is just completely disrespectful. I think in that same vein, allowing Varus to go over on R1 for Hansama is also just kind of a waste of resources. I'm not saying that you should always early pick something like Varus or you always have to ban out something like Varus, but Hansama's been a full-on liability at this tournament in terms of his positioning and just his general lane awareness, giving him the one champion in the game that can be kind of an all-arounder, a jack of all trades, and, you know, can actually be successful at everything. It's just, again, it's kind of hiding his weaknesses and allowing him to be more useful than maybe he normally would be on other champions. The only positive thing I can say for this Gen.G draft in terms of how they set themselves up is that you basically got all of G2's good picks out in game number 1. Even Broken Blade's Jax, you have things like Caps' Yone. A lot of these things are gone, and so you're looking at this as potentially a situation where maybe they let them through on purpose and just hoped they could beat them in game 1. Either that or they just didn't prep at all for G2, because this is as traditional of a G2 perfect draft as you could possibly ask for, and I'm just not sure how they were allowed to get it. But getting into the actual gameplay, player of the game is obvious to me. It's going to Scumon. I didn't have to think about this really at all. This Maokai ran this game in terms of how things went, and I'm serious. There is a stark difference. I tweeted this out after game 1. The difference between G2 on Maokai versus G2, like without being able to play around a space-eating engage tank like Maokai, is absurd. The way they play around this champion is so much more consistent, and Scumon in particular looks so much more aggressive and active and comfortable when he does get to play this champion. Now, he can't play it for the rest of the series because it is fearless, but, you know, play it in game number 1, pick up that victory, look good on the champ, do your thing, man. Like, he was always in the right place at the right time to be able to help out his laners. I think specifically that turn on the top lane 1v1 with Jax and Renekton that ended up landing Scumon an extra kill while, you know, mid lane was already going positive for G2, just kind of put things a little bit out of control. There were also a couple of fights around objectives where it was very clear that Gen.G had really no answer to the Maokai ultimate to be able to step up and do anything. That's all Scumon, and again, G2 just feels more comfortable when they get the chance to play around this. But it wasn't just him. Caps had a great game on Yone, and he's the one player that's actually just been good this year, although I will say, like, he's not been as good as he was in 2024. That being said, he's still the best player on G2, and he still is carrying them across the finish line. He was more relevant than Chovy in this game. I don't think Chovy was the problem at all for Gen.G, and maybe that's, you know, glazing or whatever, as every comment likes to tell me, but Caps was just really solid at being able to follow everything up here. He stayed relatively neutral with Chovy throughout a lot of this game, was only down like 20 CS, which I consider a win for basically anybody going into Chovy, and then was very useful in these team fights to combo off of, you know, Lebrov and Broken Blade being able to jump on the back line. Broken Blade had a great game. I think he was helped a lot by the fact that Scumon spent some time top lane and that Canyon really didn't. I think that that was a choice for Gen.G that I do not agree with. I think getting Keen into a great spot here, or even just spending more time on Ruler, would have been more helpful than, you know, Canyon basically doing nothing throughout a lot of the early game, but Broken Blade ended up coming out on top of that. Hans and Lebrov were fine enough. Lebrov overextending a couple of times for kills around objectives, but you can't really fault G2 too much. They were in a good spot for most of this game. And for Gen.G, they just played awful. Like, they just missed position. They used cooldowns at really bad times, and overall didn't have very good setups for fights. You saw Ruler using culling and then, not having it for a dragon fight, where it's just like, okay. Same thing for Keen and the Dominus on the Renekton. It's just like, you don't have to use every ability that you have all the time. It just felt like they were a little bit, mentally not there in this game. And I think that that's a fair thing to say. Ruler is my easy choice for dead of the game. He had a awful game number 1. Like, he was pretty terrible in this first game. I don't expect him to continue to play like this. Lucian is historically one of his better champions. I wouldn't say his best. That's Xayah for sure, but Lucian is definitely one of the more successful Ruler champions, and he just never really felt comfortable in this game. Like I said, blowing cooldowns early, stepping up and getting caught out, being way too passive at times, positioning rather poorly. Not really a lot of good to take away from Ruler's performance. But it wasn't just him. I think Canyon had a pretty bad game on the Xin Zhao. I certainly think it's going a bit under the radar just how much Skewmon had pressure in the mid game when he really should not have been allowed to do that. Keen ends up 1-5-1. I don't think it was entirely his fault. He had a gold lead on the top side, but it probably should have been bigger. Again, I can't stress enough how much this matchup in particular with the Xin Zhao in the jungle should have been massacred for Gen.G. Top side should not have been playable for G2 Esports top or jungle, in my opinion. Chovy was fine. Again, I know the scoreline doesn't look great, but he wasn't the issue in this game. Duro can't do anything on Braum when everybody else is losing. Like, Gen.G just kind of felt mentally out of it in game number 1, and they've got to turn that around going into game 2. I'm not panicking just yet. Anybody can lose a game number 1, but if you aren't able to fix it for game 2, if you go down 2-0 in this series, I know Gen.G has shown that they have the mental fortitude to be able to come back in a series like this, and I certainly would never count them out in any situation, but you don't want to have to win 3 games in a row against a team that just beat you twice. And for G2, the miracle is happening right now. Like, Gen.G is as beatable as they will ever be at the current moment with the circumstances that they're in. No stage time, clearly jet lagged. If you're ever going to beat this team, now is the moment. You got to step up and you got to win this game number 2. But are they going to be able to do it, or is Gen.G going to even up the series? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece, and they're going to play much better in game 2 than they did in game number 1. Now, don't mistake what I'm saying. Don't try and make it out to say that there were no problems with how Gen.G played this game. For the most part, I think G2 really underwhelmed in terms of their performance. They ended up picking a couple of things that ended up being pretty useless throughout this game. There are parts of this draft that I really like, parts of this draft that I really don't, and I don't always agree with the community on where that is going to land, but Gen.G had a couple of options in this game in terms of where they wanted to play it out, and they ended up just getting a very big gold lead, were able to run over things with their wallet in the back half of the game. I still think there's a lot they need to improve on, a lot they need to get better at, but at least for now, they are getting themselves back into this series. Let's go ahead and talk about it, of course, starting with that draft, and honestly, it's pretty easy to break down where both of these teams are looking. A lot of engage on both sides. They want to make it as easy as possible to try to play for these late game engages. Now, Gen.G does it in a slightly different way because they don't really have, a Ryze, Senna, like carry duo combo that wants to play for late game. G2 theoretically scales better going into the later part of the game because they have way more damage coming their way in their front line with Tahm Kench and Galio, and, Wukong engages can actually be pretty consistent, but Gen.G's front to back is a lot better than it gets credit for, or at least, it can be, because Vi and Alistar as an engaged duo is probably more consistent than Wukong just being raw engage on the other side, a Realm Warp potentially coming in from Ryze. And so I think there are options for both of these sides. What I really like about Gen.G's draft is it gives you more options in the early game to actually go out and, generate your own lead. I think you're looking at a couple of matchups that are very favorable, most specifically this Aurora. In the mid lane, you're letting Chovy kind of unlock himself by being a lot more aggressive with this draft to pair up with the Vi. Typically, you see Vi paired with things like Talia, which obviously were banned out, or the Ahri, which was obviously banned out, but I really like Aurora as an option because I think it just gives you a bit more instant combat power, which can be really helpful for Vi, who's been nerfed a lot over the past couple of patches. Her damage is incredibly low. She really is just set up at this point, and Aurora, I think, helps fix and nullify some of those problems, and so I like that duo a lot, and generally, I think Chovy's in a really good spot because of this draft, but I think on the flip side, like I said, G2's scaling going into the late game is probably a bit more consistent, if only because they have a ton more damage, and a lot of that comes down to the Senna in the bot lane. People are really criticizing the Senna pick, and I get it. It was useless this game. I don't think it's a draft problem. To me, the biggest problem in this draft is the Ryze on R5. I think that's the biggest mistake. Not only are you not really able to answer Aurora without using your Realm Warp defensively or reactively in this game, but I don't think you're ever actually going to be that big of a problem in the late game because you're looking at like Vi being able to full engage. Ryze has no range in comparison to a lot of the other mages who want to try to fight at this point in the game, and you flex the Galio into the top lane because it's fantastic as a matchup into Rumble. It's Rumble's worst matchup in the meta right now, but answering it specifically by having Galio or a Rise on R5, I think does kind of weaken the impact of that, and I think we kind of felt that overarching problem throughout the game. That being said, this was a bit of an execution diff. Gen.G has just more pressure in the early game. Part of that is the middle of the map, which we could have expected with Vi Aurora just being able to generate a ton. Even the Jhin is going to be in an okay spot in this game, but part of that is just them being better. And you can look at some teamfight positioning mistakes, but for the most part, they were so far ahead that, you know, we're kind of nitpicking if we're really getting down to the nitty-gritty like that. Ruler's going to get player of the game for me. Nice bounce back from him after a miserable game number 1 on the Lucian. Were there some moments that he could have been a bit better in terms of the team fights? Yes. Do I think he still played really well in this game at generating his own lead? Absolutely. I think that he's almost being underrated for this performance. I think the Jhin absolutely took over in terms of the damage. And when you're talking about the difference in terms of relevance between the Jhin and the Senna in this game, I think it was pretty clear just how big of a bot lane gap there ended up being between these two teams. I think the other major gap was in the jungle. Canyon had a really great game on the Vi. This is a champion that had not picked up a win at this tournament up until this point. It had lost every single game that it was played in the play-in stage. That's not indicative of where Vi is as a champion. I do think there is something to glean from that because, you know, as I said in my meta report video and as I've talked about at this tournament, I think Vi is overvalued and overrated by a lot of teams at this tournament. I think that things like Xin Zhao and Pantheon are inherently more consistent than those other champions, than Vi. But, you know, I get why you want to prioritize her. I still think she can be pretty useful, and I don't think she's bottom tier or anything like that. I just think you need to be a good player in order to make her work, and Canyon was a good player here. Chovy picks up a quadra kill throughout the back half of this game and looks really good in the team fights. I wanted to see more action out of him in the early game, but still ended up working out. And Keen was very quietly phenomenal. This is not a good Rumble game. This is not a great setup for him to be in a great spot to carry, but I thought his positioning and his raw damage coming out from the equalizer in the back half was played basically perfectly. He was probably the most consistent member of the team. He just didn't really have the highs because his matchup didn't allow it. It was a nice win for Gen.G, and it was, you know, a predictably bad loss for G2. This is more of the G2 we expected to see here. Once they're off of Maokai, once they don't have that space control basically for free throughout a lot of their game, then yeah, they don't look particularly comfortable playing against a team like Gen.G. And, you know, even with Gen.G making mistakes, there was nobody on this team that was even trying to capitalize on those mistakes. You draft a matchup for Caps that I think makes it very difficult for him to take over the game. Maybe the Rise can get super fed here and can really affect the map. I think it's harder for him to do that here than it has been for other games that he has been placed onto champions like this previously. I think you draft a top lane that is going to be very good in isolation, and the Galio should be relevant, but how exactly does that impact your damage profile later on in the game, especially if Ryze is going to have a hard time actually team fighting? You're not getting basically anything out of Galio in the late game from a damage perspective, which puts a lot of pressure onto Hansama and Labrov to win lane and to actually be in a good spot. Hans has no stacks by the end of this game on the Senna and ends up just being entirely useless. I think the bot lane gap ends up being the big difference maker. Hans is just not as good as Ruler, and Hans is going to get dead of the game. Part of it, again, is the matchup. I'm not going to blame him entirely, but it's been a consistent trend. This guy, when given the opportunity to be somebody that steps up internationally, lets his team down. I'm just not really a fan of where Hansama has been at this tournament. Broken Blade's getting a lot of the hype for being bad at MSI so far. I think Hansama's been just as bad. I said it in the preamble. I will continue to believe it. Hans has just not been that guy at this tournament. Skewmon looks entirely different when he plays Maokai versus when he plays anything else. I think Wukong is one of his better champions. It's just, how much does that even matter in this instance? And Labrov was getting bursted even on Tom Kench later on in this game. Bot lane gap was pretty huge. So G2 not able to keep their momentum up. They're not able to go up 2-0. It's tied at 1 apiece now. Things aren't over yet, though. Gen.G certainly doesn't look unbeatable in the form that they brought to the table in the first 2 games. If you can pick up a miraculous game 3, all of a sudden, you know, things look pretty interesting, and we've seen crazier things happen already at this tournament. But for Gen.G, if you're able to pick up that game 3, especially if you start to look better and better as this series goes along, I think things start to get a little bit more clear as to where the priorities are. So which of those is going to happen? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up for the first time in this series 2-1. And yeah, we were looking for the most dominant game of the series, and that's exactly what they gave us. This is a vintage Canyon performance, and you don't even really need me to tell you exactly what went wrong in this game for G2. If you watched it, you got a pretty good idea. Canyon got so unbelievably fed. He controlled the game so well on this Lee Sin. Basically from level 2, he goes and invades Gromp and just completely breaks open the game for not only only himself, but kind of destroys what Skewmond is able to do throughout a lot of the rest of the game. And from that point onwards, there wasn't a single play made on the map that didn't directly get influenced by the Lee Sin and by Canyon's decision-making and his overall lead. This was a masterclass in how to destroy the game as a jungler, and you just have to give him credit for it. Like, this is what Canyon does at his absolute best. I can sit here all I want, put him at number 2 in my jungle rankings, and criticize the inconsistencies, the bad games that he ends up having, because those do still exist. He's not the most consistent player in the universe, but when he wins, there is no jungler in the history of League of Legends that has ever come close to winning nearly as hard as Canyon does. There is a reason it's called a jungle Canyon, and it's not just because the gap is super large. He has earned this title of being the most dominant jungler of all time, whether you want to consider him the greatest or not, and I think this game continues to prove that. For G2, oops, like, you ran into Canyon's Lee Sin and you got bodied. Like, how much do I even really want to talk about this? Like, I don't know, you know what I mean? Like, this game is just going to happen. You just kind of have to let it happen to you because there's no real way to play it out. But I guess we can talk about drafts. I think it's kind of interesting. You wouldn't necessarily look at Gen.G's comp and think that they outscale, but I do think eventually you hit a point where Orianna Cassante just becomes too difficult for G2 to actually deal with. I know you have a ton of engage, and I get simplifying the process for G2 with Rel Jarvan continuing to be like frontline pieces that can kind of go in, trying to replicate the performances you had in the first couple of games, trying to, like I said earlier, simplify the draft and not overthink it. You have Victor and Ezreal to be able to follow up. Gnar obviously can make a lot of plays, can play side lanes if he needs to. Victor can catch waves as well. Just a very versatile comp, but I think the problem here for G2 is that they kind of didn't get a lead early. Like, there's really nothing else to say. You didn't punish the Lee Sin, the R5 Lee Sin, and it ended up really taking over. For Gen.G, I think it is risky to draft this. I think you do kind of have to be the better team in order to execute this well. Misfortune needs to be relevant in the early game to play alongside the Lee Sin, because you're likely not going to get a ton out of, like, Orianna very quickly into this game. Even the Cassante, I think, theoretically should struggle early, even if it is Keen Sante, and so it doesn't really end up mattering. But if Lee's able to take over, it doesn't really matter what happens on G2's side. They don't have a way to answer this bruiser jumping onto their backline. Rel, Jarvan, Gnar, like, all of this engage is all well and good. If you have no one to engage upon because the moment you go in, you die, it just doesn't really end up mattering, and that's kind of the situation they found themselves in. Again, Canyon's player of the game. Like, what do you even want me to say? I know that there are a lot of analysts and players out there that are like, Lee Sin's only okay on the current patch. Like, Lee Sin's not, a great pro pick. I kind of disagree. I think this champ's super underplayed right now. I think he's actually very strong. I think that there is a lot of potential for him to just completely take over games. I think you could even make the argument that from a pure snowballing perspective, it's almost more dominant to get snowballed on Lee Sin than almost any other jungler right now in the game, just for how easy it is to be able to execute on that. Maybe I'm just smoking the wrong stuff here, the copium or whatever, but I think Lee Sin's a very, very strong pick in the meta if you're good at him right now, and Canyon obviously is great at Lee Sin. I wouldn't be surprised to see this pick kind of emerge a bit at this tournament. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I'm not going to try and call my shot. I was already wrong about my Kindred shot that I called pre-tournament because I really did think that champ was going to get more play, but at least for now, like, I'm not surprised to see Lee Sin doing well. I think that champ has a lot going for him, and I think he's underplayed in the current meta, but you also gave over Keen Sante. Like, really the two big diffs in this game were jungle, which was an appropriate Canyon, and then top lane, which was also gigantic. Keen just obliterated Broken Blade in lane, which probably should not happen in this matchup. Gnar should be generally fine. I think going into Cassante, not how it ended up working. Chovy was fine. The bot lane existed. Like, they didn't do jack shit this game. They didn't have to do jack shit. I'm not blaming them for sitting there and being more passengers, but, like, this was a Canyon game through and through. There's not really a ton else to talk about for Gen.G, and then for G2, on the other side, Broken Blade and Skewmond had pretty horrible games, and I think that is just gonna take G2 out of it. If you have one or two players that are just easily the worst players on the Rift, it's really hard to be able to exist. It's not like the bot lane did well. Hansama ends up being really useless throughout this entire game, even though he's one of the pieces that I think you needed to look at. Broken Blade needed to step up and survive in lane. He couldn't do that. His laning is some of the worst at the entire tournament, regardless of position. In fact, I think it would be fair to claim him as the worst laner left at the tournament. I think that there are some other players like Mirwin, I think definitely is in the running for that award when he's not on his crazy counter picks on the top side. I think someone like Rest for the Flying Oysters is definitely in that conversation, but Broken Blade is also very much in that conversation. Notice how we're talking about all top laners. It's kind of just how this tournament ends up going, but Broken Blade's laning is horrific, and even on good matchups, he's not able to win. He needs great matchups in order to feel comfortable, and Skewmond got to face off against one of the best junglers of all time. Welcome to Internats, kid. Like, this is how it goes. This is what happens when you go up against the best player players in the world. You know, I'm not blaming Skumon too much. He's dud of the game because he was the worst and least valuable player in the game, but like, is it even entirely his fault? This is a rookie going up against Canyon on Lee Sin and he got bodied. Like, okay, sure, you got level 2 invaded on Gromp and you couldn't play the game from that point onwards. Awesome. Like, the Victor, I think, is fine, generally speaking. Something like Orianna as a counter pick to be able to stabilize in the late game is understandable. Victor should have lane prio there, but you're also taking Caps off of playmakers. I think there is something to say about the fact that Caps is the only guy on this team who consistently creates plays for G2 that includes Skumon and Labrov, and so putting him on something like Victor that's inherently more passive, that relies on his team a lot more, just might not be the avenue in the first place, regardless of whether or not you consider Victor to be a strong champ. So there's a lot of conversations, I think, to surround this for G2, but they have to answer this going into game number 4, because now you're sitting down 2-1. If you get blown out again in game 4, if Gen.G just progressively gets better game over game, all we can really say is that G2 basically was there to allow Gen.G to level themselves back up to their own level after being off for what is essentially a month and flying in like 24 hours before this. For Gen.G on the other side, they have gotten better every single game. Canyon is starting to lock in, but I'd love to see some consistent performances coming out from the entire team and not just isolated pieces. I would love for them to show that off in game 4. So are they going to be able to close out this series and move on to round 2, or is G2 kind of going to surprise a lot of us and push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to take this series 3-1. And honestly, we can't even really be all that surprised by this outcome. Game 4 was once again a bit closer than maybe you would have expected it to be. I think that there were some plays made by G2 that were pretty positive, all things considered. I think Caps had a pretty good game number 4 and did try to stay relevant on things like Twisted Fate, which, you know, we'll talk about. We'll talk about the draft. This is a huge win for G2 in the sense that they finally drafted something that I feel like inherently wins. The problem is that it's not good for their individual players, and so it didn't really end up working out. If there was ever an example of a mega draft gap that didn't matter because you should always draft for player comfort, this is it in favor of G2, because I really do think there's no reason they should be losing this game under any circumstances. For Gen.G, on the other side, they did look a little sloppy today, and in this game in general, there were a lot of avenues for G2 to be able to get themselves back into it. I think Caps was very proactive in trying to make plays around the map, and there were obviously a lot of optimizations that could have gone better for Gen.G, specifically from Canyon in this game after carrying game number 3, but if this is the weakest that they're going to look throughout this tournament, which, by the way, we'll talk about, this is like Gen.G at their weakest. This is the worst version of them that you will see. Not only do I expect the jet lag and the lack of scrim time to go away and to get better as this tournament goes along, but just generally, they always kind of look bad. LCK teams generally always look bad after long breaks. Like, they're teams that ramp up as they play more games. It's why their split has always been super long. Like, all of that is kind of going in against Gen.G in this series, and they still were very easily able to take down G2. And I think that's a good sign for them moving forward. So we'll go ahead and talk about it here. Again, for draft, honestly, Gen.G got mega draft gapped in this one, in my opinion. I think you're looking at 3 lanes that aren't particularly great for them. Talia's awesome on B1, and it should give Chovy some way to keep himself relevant, but Twisted Fate is actually one of the better picks into Talia in terms of the roamers. That's where I think that TF actually gains a lot of value individually as a champion, specifically as an answer to Talia, in the same way that I think something like Ahri should drop in value because of how good Talia is. TF has been gaining value mostly because of his ability to answer Talia a lot more efficiently. It doesn't really take a lot of time for him to be able to set up a lot of these creative plays in the mid game, even if he's not really doing a lot to follow up on it. I think Aatrox is generally pretty good into Jace. It's always been considered not that bad of a matchup. Jace is going to have pressure basically no matter what, and obviously there's a big player diff between Keen and Broken Blade, but I don't think Aatrox gets bodied in this by any means. In fact, I would consider it slightly Aatrox favored, and Corki's not great into Kai'Sa. One of Kai'Sa's only early game weaknesses is her lack of range, and Corki can't really punish that nearly as heavily, at least in the laning phase itself. I think Leona helps with that a little bit as well. Like, there's a lot to like generally about G2's draft. I think even Skumon on the Mundo, for as much as Mundo's been nerfed over the past couple of patches, I do still think he can be relevant in the jungle. It just didn't matter. None of these players are good at these champions. Hansama can't play something like Kai'Sa. It's certainly not in his wheelhouse. He's not really somebody that wants to play these late game hyper carries that need to be more patient. He wants to step up and be a primary damage dealer as quickly as possible in these skirmishes, and Kai'Sa does not allow him to do that. Labrov has a lot on his plate here in this one to be the primary engage threat on the Leona, which I think has been a big problem for him throughout the entirety of this year. Broken Blade got slaughtered in lane because even if it is a matchup that should be fine, he's not a good laner, and Keen is just a better player, and Caps' plays just can't really affect affect everything on the map. And so you end up in a spot where G2 doesn't actually have any pressure. So congrats to Gen.G. I don't love their draft, but I think they executed on it better. Ruler is going to get player of the game, and he's also going to get player of the series for me. Although if you wanted to give it to Canyon, I think that that's entirely fair. You would be giving it to him entirely for game number 3. And you know what? The one game that was the most dominant in the entire series was game 3, and that's what Canyon's game was. And so if you wanted to just claim him as player of the series because of that, I think that's fair. But I think Ruler played awesome in game 4, and even if he did have his own problems throughout the beginning part of the series in game 1, I thought he was the most relevant player in game 2 because of the damage he was putting out. And it's not his fault that he didn't have to do anything in game 3. He just didn't have to do anything, right? Like, Ruler was pretty good in their wins, and so he is going to get player of the series. But like I said, I think it is pretty open for debate and interpretation between Ruler and Canyon who you wanted to give player of the series to. But the Corki was huge. His damage output at the end of this game, especially in that final Baron fight, was massive for Gen.G, like actually game breaking for what they were capable of doing. He definitely was more relevant than Hansama in this series. Duro actually played great on the Poppy. I know the scoreline doesn't really indicate that, but there were a lot of big plays that I think the Poppy made, and that pick continues to really over-exceed expectations. Keen continued to dominate Broken Blade, specifically in lane. If Keen did anything outside of lane with the exception of game number 2 on the Rumble, then I would have probably given him player of the series, because the way he massacred Broken Blade in lane every single game was astounding. Like, the difference in terms of the 1v1 potential between these two players is crazy, even considering the matchups that they were in. Again, Canyon wasn't great in this game on the Skarner, and Chovy actually made a lot of mistakes in this game in terms of his roam timers and just generally, you know, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Very uncharacteristic mistakes from Chovy that he doesn't really make in the LCK. Again, I'm going to chalk it up, at least for now in the short term, to jet lag and lack of rest and lack of practice, because I do think that it's clear that they were just not locked in mentally. I think things will get better. These, again, are uncharacteristic mistakes. Even when Gen.G loses internationally, they don't really lose like this. Like, this is not the way that Gen.G is underperformed, if you want to call him choky. You know, you want to say that he's too proactive or too aware of where people are and plays too safe. Like, all of that I think makes sense. Him just walking into bushes is not something that he does all that regularly, so I think he's going to be just fine. But overall, this is Gen.G at their worst, and they still walk away with a very easy 3-1 series win. And the only time G2 ever looked competent is when they got like their perfect draft in game number 1 for their players. And so, you know, I'm not really sitting here worrying too much about Gen.G, not nearly as much as some other analysts seem to be. And then for Gen.G, or for G2, I have done that like multiple times. For G2 on the other side, you know, they just weren't very good in terms of their execution. Broken Blade was miserably bad in this series. He still is the worst player at this tournament at the current moment. I think Mirwin was going to make an argument for that. Broken Blade's been significantly worse than what Mirwin, I think, will output for Koi throughout this tournament. You know, Skewmon makes a game-losing play getting caught as Caps and Broken Blade make a play on the bot side. That obviously is not great for him, but he was pretty good throughout the rest of the game, so I'm not going to give him dead of the game. The one player that I think made the most mistakes and was the least useful was Labrov. I think he ended up playing the laning phase incredibly poorly into the Poppy on the Leona. Again, this is a bot lane that actually should be in a pretty good spot as Kai'Sa Leona, and it just wasn't, because Labrov ended up playing quite poorly, and he wasn't very relevant in the team fights either. Again, as the primary engage threat, he typically kind of falters in those situations. You need to give him other options. That's why I like Skewmon on these engage tanks, like Maokai, you know, like Wukong, or, you know, whatever, right? I think it's because it takes some of the onus off of Labrov to be the main character as the engaged threat for the team, because he's just not very good in that role. But Hansama looked entirely outclassed in this series, as he has throughout the entire tournament. Caps was the only one attempting to make plays regularly for them, as he has been throughout the entire tournament. This was a very standard G2 series, and honestly, they showed me nothing to make me feel different from how I felt coming out of the plans, which is that they are the 8th best team, the worst team left at the tournament, and that they're probably not going to do very well. Gen.G did have a lot of problems, a lot of flaws, and a lot of mistakes, but again, at least for now, until proven otherwise, I'm going to chalk it up to them, you know, having a bad situation with some rest, with some scrims, and just generally getting acclimated to playing in Canada. I think they're going to be just fine. If this is the worst they have to offer, I think they're still at worst a top 2 team at this tournament, and I'm pretty fine with that. All right, but that is going to do it for my MSI main stage day number 1 overview and analysis video here in round number 1. Gen.G moving on to round 2, G2 going down to the lower bracket. Of course, double elimination at this tournament means that nobody is done quite yet. You still have a lot to work with. It's just that G2 is expending their extra life in this tournament. Their opponent will be determined by tomorrow's matchup, or I guess today's matchup as you're watching this, between Anyone's Legend and FlyQuest. I already previewed all the round 1 series in my video ending the play-ins, fans. But to quickly recap, I think AL is favorited in this series, but I'm going against the grain. I think this is the closest of the round 1 matchups. I don't think it's going to be Movistar versus BLG like everybody else seems to make it out to be. I think AL and FlyQuest are a lot more evenly matched than people give them credit for. I still think AL is the second best team at this tournament behind Gen.G, but I think FlyQuest is the best team in the West, and honestly, they match up pretty well overall into AL. If you can get Masu going into the late game, you know, AL's the type of team, in the LPL in general are the type of region to make a lot of mistakes and to allow resources to go over to the enemy. If you give, you know, Masu quad inspired like a bridge, they're going to take something. They're a great team fighting team, and if these games go long, I could actually see Fly even just outperforming in some front-to-back 5v5s because that's what they're really good at. Now, their early games are trash, at least for now. Like, they're good players, but their setups have been quite bad, and that's what AL can take advantage of. I think AL is still big favorites in this series, but for me, I'm actually predicting this to be AL 3-1. I think FlyQuest is good enough to be able to take a game, especially if they get one of their members fed. Let me know if you agree or disagree with Fly being more interesting in this series than people are giving them credit for, or if you agree that they're going to get blown out, that AL is just significantly better, like a lot of other analysts seem to believe. I'm curious to know what you guys think of that as well down in the comment section below, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're covering every single day of MSI on this channel, as we always do. And so if you want comprehensive overviews of everything going on at MSI in the same way that we did here today, hit subscribe, hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all